Hi, I'm Donna Spencer, and in this video I'm going to share some of my experiences with card sorting to help you get going on your next project. I've been working as an information architect for a long time now. I wrote an entire book about card sorting published by Rosenfeld Media, and one on information architecture distributed by UX Mastery. I've worked on all kinds of large content-heavy sites, including government, universities, telecommunications, e-commerce and lots more. I've taught information architecture and card sorting for years and regularly mentor my clients in how to run card sorts for their own sites. So what is card sorting? It's a user research technique. You can use it to learn about how your users think about content, groupings and terminology. The basic approach is to give people cards. If we were doing it in person, these would be physical index cards that list content from your site. They arrange these into groups that make sense for them and describe the groups with a short label. From this you can learn about what they think goes together, why it goes together, and what they would call it. This is all super useful information when you're trying to organise content in a way that works for your users. Why would you run a card sort? When you're trying to organise a set of content, you'll find there are lots of ways you can do it. For example, if you were organising recipes, you'd find that you could organise them by cuisine, dish, occasion, difficulty, or other ways. You might choose a way but find that it's not particularly useful for your users. You might think that cuisine is obvious, then find out that they want to find recipes that are quick to cook. If you don't involve your users, you risk doing something that doesn't work for them. And just like other user research methods, if you do involve your users, you'll learn lots of interesting things that will help you to design better products and to organise your content better. There are other reasons you might run a card sort. Sometimes it's good to show stakeholders or colleagues that people think differently to them. Sometimes you want to make sure you involve people in the design process, even when you're fairly confident about how you organise the content. Card sorting is a great way to involve people, as it's straightforward to run and easy to do. I just want to mention one other important thing about running a card sort. Although you'll get great information from it, you can't use it directly just to create the information architecture for a site. You still have to combine what you learn with other user research, content analysis, and the purpose of the site. Card sorting doesn't do all your work for you. There are a few different types of card sorting. Before you start, think about why you want to do this and what you're hoping to learn. This will help you decide which type to use. In an open card sort, you give cards to people and they decide what groups they will make and what to call them. In a closed card sort, you give cards to people and the categories and see what cards they put in each category. In a hybrid card sort, you give them cards and some starter categories, and they can make extra groups if they like. Open card sorting is great for seeing how people will group the content. It's the method I use most often and the one I find most useful. Closed card sorting is useful to see if the content will fit in the categories. Sometimes people use it to test that the categories they have will work for users to find information. But this isn't really a good way of doing that. A tree test, using TreeJack, where you ask people where they would look for something, is a much better way of doing this. Hybrid card sorting is useful when you have some categories that you'll have to continue to work with, but are not sure whether they reflect how people think about content and groups. It's also useful if you want to let people discard cards into categories like, I don't understand this, or I'd never use this. This is my favourite way to use hybrid card sorting. Before you get started with setting up the actual card sort, there are a couple of other things to think about. Do you want to be able to analyse your results according to some attribute of your users, like age, experience or job role, and see if there are differences and similarities? If so, you'll have to collect this information. Do you want to learn more about your audience generally? You can ask people basic survey questions at the same time. And of course, you need to think about how you'll get the card sort out to your users and how to encourage them to participate. I'm not going to go into that in detail as it's an enormous topic in itself. Okay, so let's start getting into the detail of running this card sort. Everything hinges on the cards you choose, so this is absolutely the most important part to put time into. Firstly, how many cards will you include? For an online card sort, I don't usually use more than about 100 cards, as it's tricky to keep track of them on the screen. If your content is fairly straightforward, like supermarket groceries or recipes, you can use more cards than if you're dealing with more complex, legal, scientific or technical content. It's important to test your card sort before you run it with your users, and this is something you can check when you test it. If people are abandoning it or finding it hard, reduce the number of cards. The content you choose doesn't have to be everything on your site. And that would usually be impossible anyway, given I just said to use a maximum of 100 cards. What you want is to make a set of cards that's representative of your overall set of content. So you don't need to include every page or item, just make sure the ones you do choose cover the content well. But make sure that the content you have can actually be grouped. You don't want to bias or lead the activity, but you do want people to be able to make groups out of the cards. If you're working on a large site, it can be tricky to choose content that's representative of the whole, and where there's enough similarity or overlap that people will be able to group it. If you find yourself in this position, you might want to run a card sort just on a section of the site at a time, or run it with broad concepts or topics instead of individual pages or items. I've made this mistake in the past, and people just stare at the cards and don't see how they can be grouped. Again, you'll be able to check this is okay when you test the sort before you run it. You also want to make sure the content is stuff that people will understand. If they don't understand what it's about, they will just sort it according to surface characteristics, which gives poor results, or they'll just abandon it. I usually tell people that they can put aside anything they don't understand, and using a hybrid sort is good for that, as they can see where to put the cards. Make sure the cards are all around the same level of detail. Don't include some content that's clearly a name of a broad idea and some that's clearly detailed pages or items. It's hard to figure out how to group things when they're a mixture of broad and detailed concepts. And labelling the cards is super important. People mostly just want to get through the activity quickly and will take shortcuts if they can. It's not they don't want to help, but when they're faced with a pile of cards, they look for somewhere to make a start. One of the easiest shortcuts is to group cards that have similar words, even if they don't kind of work together as a concept. For example, if you had a lot of cards that started with how to, people will put them together, even though this may not make a particularly good grouping on a website. You might need to rewrite a bunch of labels to get around this, especially to remove words like policy, guideline, and anything to do with the format of the information. Let's look at how you do this in Optimal Sort. I've set up a new sort already. I'm going to use the UX Australia conference presentations as my example content. To get the cards in, you can type the names straight in. This is a good option if you have a small number of cards or need to type up the cards anyway. But if you have a big number of cards and it's in a spreadsheet or list already, you can just paste them in. Just make sure that they're in a format that has one card per line and copy and paste them in. That's much faster. It's the same if you're using a closed or a hybrid sort. Type the categories in or import them. So you have your cards already, and that's the main part done. There are a couple of other things to do before you send the card sort off to your participants. Write your invitation emails, tweets, etc., however you intend to get the card sort out to people. Then check the instructions in Optimal Sort. It has a good basic set of instructions for you to start with. Change these to represent the activity that you're running and to be in your voice. Make sure they flow nicely from your invitation. Most importantly, go through the card sort as if you're a participant, and then test your card sort with other people before you run it. You might be able to get some teammates or colleagues, or even users who you know and are comfortable asking to do a test run. No matter how much experience I have with running card sorts, I always make silly mistakes that aren't obvious until I go to do the sort myself. I usually find cards that still have leading titles and cards that feel like they're groups already. This is also a good chance to get an idea of how long it might take somebody to do the activity. You can either test it as a preview, which means your results won't be saved, or launch it and then delete the test results. When you're ready, launch the activity and invite participants. Then all you need to do is wait for the results to come in. You can keep an eye on the number of responses on the dashboard, and you can peek at the results as they come in. Okay, your results have come in and it's time to do some analysis. Before we get started with looking at the results, let's think about what you want to learn from this process. Stopping and thinking about this helps you to focus and not get overwhelmed by all the data. The things we want to learn about are, what kind of groups do people create? Are there any particular organisation schemes that you could spot? For example, it could be possible that people could sort conference talks into inspiring, case study, practical, technique, or they could group them by topic. It's actually rare to see anything consistent emerge, but it's always interesting to look for it. What do people call the groups they made? And what's interesting about how they labelled things? What went into the groups? You need to look at this, as sometimes people will make what looks like a consistent set of groups, but they can have very different content inside them. How much similarity was there across the sort? Was everyone wildly different, or were they pretty similar? Are there some places where they were similar and others where they're different? What did people do with the easy cards? Was it what you expected? What did people do with the hard cards? Which cards turned out to be the hard cards? Which were left out consistently or put into miscellaneous categories? Before we can start to analyse, we need to do a bit of pre-processing of the data. This will tidy things up and make it easier to analyse. When people create and name groups, sometimes they'll use the same words, sometimes they'll use slightly different words, and sometimes they'll misspell the group names. We want to combine everything that's the same so we can look at it as one thing, not many. Here you can see that many people created a category called accessibility. Most of these are identical, but there are some misspellings. I'm going to combine them all into one thing and call it accessibility. There's one here called accessible and inclusive design. I could combine that with accessibility as the overall idea is basically the same. But because it's a combined label, like it has two words in it with an and, I'm going to leave it alone. I want to look at that group, the accessibility group, and the inclusive design group and see whether they're actually the same or different. Here's another example: agile and lean methods, agile and lean UX. I'm going to combine those. The methods and UX words don't seem to be particularly important or introducing a different concept, so I'm confident I can combine those without messing up the results. And another. Here some people have used IA and some information architecture. I'll combine those as the acronym and the word is the same concept. Go through all your results and do this. It'll take a while. Don't overdo it though. You don't want to lose information by combining things that really aren't the same. And you can also see what you've done and undo any if you need later on. Now we can look at each of our analysis questions. What kind of groups did people create? Are there any particular organisation schemes? And what did they call the groups? We can do this all from the Categories tab. If you sort this in descending order by participants, you can see all the standardised popular categories together. This is easier than trying to look at the whole list at once. Just poke around with these for a while and see what you learned. I learned that case studies was a strong concept that almost half the participants used. Accessibility was pretty consistent too, which I expected. But I was surprised that so many people use service design, especially as the talk titles don't necessarily include that word. Our second analysis question was to see what cards put in each group and then how much consistency there was in the sort overall. We can do that from the Categories tab and the Standardisation grid. In the Categories tab, you can look at a group and see what cards were put in it. This can give you an idea of what the group means and what people think it's about. We can see that even though lots of people had a concept of case studies, there were a lot of different cards put into it. Almost half the cards were put into this category by someone. This is what the agreement column tells us. It indicates how consistent the cards were within the group. The higher the number, the more consistent the cards were. When we sort by that column, we can see that case studies has the lowest number. First time users is the highest. It was used by 3 people. 3 of them included all 3 cards and 2 included just these top 2 cards. That's a pretty tight group. It can be easier to see what cards went into each group from the Standardisation grid tab. This is the place where you can really see whether people were consistent in the way they approached the sort, or inconsistent. You can see that mine is all over the place, which I did expect to happen. We can look at the case studies group again and see that even though it had almost half the cards put in it at some point, there are a few that were put in there more often than others. I usually copy and paste this into a spreadsheet if it's big. It makes it a bit easier to see and play with. Again, poke around in this and see what you find interesting. Our next question is to see what people did with each card. You can do this in the Cards tab and the Similarity matrix. First look at the Cards tab. From here you can simply inspect each card. Again, poke around and see what interesting things people did. In this card sort, I let people leave cards unnamed and unsorted. I don't like forcing people to finish as it can give poor results. And I can see what cards were hard to sort. This talk on Memento Mori was one that I thought might be difficult. Not only is the title unclear if you haven't come across the concept, but there was nothing else about designing for what happens after people die. I knew it would be hard to find partners for. And we can see that's how it turned out. 7 people left it unsorted and some gave it a neutral name or a strange name. The other place you can see what happened with individual cards is in the Similarity matrix. This shows, for each card, how often it was paired with each other card. It attempts to cluster them a bit as well. You can see that these two cards on accessibility were put together 84% of the time. I think that's the strongest pairing in this activity. This is really fun to look at and see what went together. You'll notice there are two tabs I didn't explain. The statistics behind these are fairly complicated, so I'll explain them in a more advanced video. If you asked questions in the questionnaire, don't forget to have a look at these too. You can see them in the Questions tab. In a future video, I'll show you how to analyse the results according to what people answered here. So I bet you're thinking, wow, that raised a whole lot more questions than it answered. That's okay, any good research will do that. Research isn't about finding answers, it's about finding questions. What's most important is that you found out some interesting things and that you can use what you learned when you go on to draft an IA. The next steps from here depend on what kind of project you're working on and what you learned from your card sort. Sometimes you might want to do a bit more research to answer some questions that came up. But if you learned enough, go ahead and create your information architecture. Make sure you use everything else you know, not just the card sort, and then test the draft IA with TreeJack. In an advanced analysis video, we'll learn about things like tips for closed and hybrid sorts, adding extra details to cards like pictures and descriptions, whether to do things like letting people skip cards or leave groups unnamed, including only a subset of cards, analysing the results for a subset of participants based on the questionnaire, and digging into analysis a bit more deeply. So that's all for now. I hope you found this video useful.